The Grim Drive podcast explores mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. Pro athletes come forward more and more with stories about their mental health journey, what they have endured, and how they managed to push through, reflecting a mental health stigma that continues to be reduced. Pro athletes also leverage mindset to achieve peak performance, as well as representing and often driving elements of popular culture through the use of social media, technology, and personal branding. This places athletes front and center as role models for people of all ages, giving them a platform to reach many and deliver important information, including information about mental health. Welcome to the Grim Drive podcast, where we explore mental health through the lens of professional sports and athletes. My name is Jonathan Busfield, and I'm here with John Cuna. Today we'll be discussing dopamine, and really, hormones in general, but dopamine is kind of the main focus. Before we get to that, this is our 40th episode. We usually do something kind of outside the box for every 10th episode, so I wouldn't say this is quite in that realm. It's a little bit. I think we got some other things coming up that probably would be typically what we would do for an every 10th episode. We're going to eventually do an episode on, or possibly more than one, depends on Ted Lasso. John, you got to watch it.
I got to catch up.
Right?
I know.
I got started, right?
I know. I have started. I've seen episode 1, and it's great. I need to dive in more and get it all done.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, it's interesting because we always joke around about how much as coaches or therapists, what part Wendy Rhodes are we from Billions, right? What part Ted Lasso are we?
Yep.
How many episodes of Ted Lasso have you watched?
Just the one.
Just the one.
Just
so
the
did
first
you see
episode.
Roy Kent?
No.
Okay.
Not yet.
You'll laugh at this. So
okay.
My sister kind of jokes around that I'm more Roy Kent than I am like Ted Lasso or that kind of thing. So once you see his character, you'll understand that a little bit more. But we're definitely going to do an episode where we kind of recap Ted Lasso because there's so many different good things in there about just from a coaching perspective, from a team sports perspective, from an individual athlete perspective. And look, it's a show, it's fictional, but there's a lot of great stuff in there that I think that relates to the work we do and some of the people we work with. And I think it'd be a funny episode for us to funny and informative episode for us to tackle. We might bring on a guest host from Riser and Tread to join us in that. So we'll save that surprise. We might also do an episode on the best and worst movie / show therapist at some point.
Big time.
That's definitely something we're going to do.
Yep.
Spoiler alert.
It's Sean from Good Will Hunting. We can
probably going to be at the top of the list. That doesn't mean you shouldn't listen anyway.
Yep.
If you don't, it's not your fault. So we got some good episodes coming up. We just recently did an episode where we interviewed Nathan Baugh. He has got a newsletter and a sort of startup company called Sideline Sprint, which we encourage everyone to check out. That was our 38th episode. Our last episode before this we just did on the kind of Blackhawks scandal that was going on, which we had talked about before. Was just we were confused as to why it wasn't getting more attention, and now it is for different reasons. So encourage people to listen to that episode because we do cover sort of a wide spectrum in terms of the people who experience mental health and how it relates to athletes and sports. So for this episode, again, we're going to talk about dopamine. We're going to talk about hormones in general. John, specifically, you're going to talk about the main kind of hormone players that we should know about or people should know about if they're interested. But there was a Wall Street Journal article by Anna Lemke, about how digital addictions are drowning us in dopamine. And this was something we've had on the slate to talk about for quite some time.
Long time.
When I saw it, it's sort of it's one of those articles where you see the not headlines, what the titles, of an article is sometimes clickbaitish, but this was more I saw the title and I was like, okay, I want to read this, and I read it and I'm like, this kind of describes exactly what I think a lot of people are struggling with, whether they know it or not. So Anna Lemke is an American psychiatrist who's the chief of Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic. She's a specialist in the opioid epidemic in the U.S. and an author of Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop. So she wrote this article about dopamine and how digital addictions are impacting us. And I think our systems are kind of flooded with dopamine from so many different directions nowadays, whether it's video games, social media, the internet in general. You've even talked about movie or show watching platforms sort of not having stop cues and things like that. There was that Netflix special, what was it called?
The Social Experiment, I think. No.
Something like that, yeah. The Social Dilemma.
Social Dilemma, yep.
Which was definitely popular maybe about a year ago, a little bit less than that, that really goes into social media platforms and who created them and how they created them to sort of hijack some addictive processes in the brain.
Yep.
Pretty scary stuff. So in here they even talk about how, quote, the quantity, variety, and potency of highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors has never been greater. In addition to addictive substances like sugar and opioids, there's also a whole new class of electronic addictions that didn't exist until about 20 years ago, like texting, tweeting, surfing the web, online shopping, and gambling. These digital products are engineered to be addictive, using flashing lights, celebratory sounds, and likes to be able to promise ever greater rewards that are just a click away. That to me is a great summary of like sort of the position we're all in.
Yep.
And I don't think people quite realize how much it's impacting them. So we're going to get into our takeaways from this article, and obviously a focus on dopamine, often called the molecule of more. But I want to kick it to you, John, just to educate people a little bit about what is dopamine versus some of the other major hormones that people should know about in terms of how it impacts them.
Yeah, and we're going to get into dopamine specifically, but like you said, it's sort of like your pleasure hormone or like your reward system,
Yep.
right? So, some of this sugar and beeps and notifications on your phone activate dopamine production, which you are like, oh, I want more of that, right? So we're going to dive into dopamine specifically. So that's sort of like your pleasure hormone. Some of the other big ones are endorphins, oxytocin, serotonin, and cortisol. And endorphins is the next one, and that's sometimes referred to as like your happiness hormone, which is very different than pleasure. A lot of people, one of the best ways that you can get endorphins is through like high intensity workouts. And so some people might know this by like the runner's high, right? So after you work out, endorphins are released sort of as a way, it's kind of like your body's own production of like morphine, essentially. It's to kind of help mask the pain that you might be in after. So, you work out and then afterwards you get that release of endorphins. It makes you feel like, wow, this was really great. Also to help code that exercise is important and to sort of reward the exercise post it. No one really gets endorphins while working out. That's usually not a pleasurable experience. But then you get that rush afterwards. So it's your body's way of sort of both, yes, rewarding, but also sort of, like I said, the kind of like a morphine effect. And then serotonin is sort of like a mood stabilizer almost, or like your willpower. You're designed to like be active and to be doing things. And serotonin often relates to like when receptors aren't working properly, when serotonin is low, depression, anxiety are typically pretty high. So medication usually around depression and anxiety is centered around serotonin production and receptors that receive and monitor that.
So this would be why they're called like SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors.
Yes.
Are what antidepressants are typically?
Yep,
Okay.
exactly.
Yep.
It's to sort of monitor and manage serotonin levels within that. So serotonin helps with like sleeping. It helps with eating and digestion. It's one of the good, just sort of like helps the body just feel good. The other one too is we refer to cortisol, which is often referred to as like the stress hormone. So when you're feeling stress, when you're feeling an overamount, you get cortisol releasing into the brain, which, trying really hard not to sound too encyclopedic, but a lot of that stuff starts to cortisol's effect when there's too much involved in the brain. It shuts off the part of the brain that allows you to like think properly and kind of helps put you into that like fight, flight, or freeze mentality. So when you're in sort of like either a state of high stress or panic, the two main hormones that get released are adrenaline and cortisol. Adrenaline kind of like gears you up, and cortisol kind of shuts the thinking down. So not a great combination if you're in a state you need to think clearly. So cortisol is your stress hormone, and what gets released when you're in high states of stress. And then oxytocin is the other one. Lots of cool new research on oxytocin, and I'm not going to go.
Hormone?
Yeah, it's
okay.
like the cuddle hormone that we think of. So
yeah.
like if you embrace somebody, and research is a little bit both ways here, but the idea is that if you embrace somebody for more than 25 seconds, this was one study that actually like calculated this, that oxytocin gets released in, and you feel that like support, that contribution, that love.
Physical touch is really key for that. Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. So oxytocin is sort of like a relationship builder. Some cool new research is that it can actually invoke biases in the people that you surround yourself with, and can actually contribute to prejudice type of thinking, which was interesting. I haven't done as much thinking, and that could be maybe a different conversation that we have, but I thought that was one. So yeah, oxytocin is like your relationship hormone or your love hormone. Again, it's one of the things that we talk about. So those are sort of the Fab Five, maybe, or like the big ones that we talk about. Of course, there are more hormones in our body than just those, but those are the ones that specifically relate to like mental health and how we're feeling. Those are the sort of the main contributors to how those things go down.
It's interesting, yeah. And there was hormones are fascinating to me. I'm not like an expert in that area at all, but
Yeah.
just understanding like how they sort of control everything,
Yeah.
and can shut off. I mean, even processes like appetite, growth, stress, blood sugar, sleep cycles, sex
Sleep.
drive, sex function, all kinds of different things. Like they all play a role in that, and it's both fascinating and kind of scary at the same time because it's like really intriguing to learn about in terms of how intricate this system is inside a human body. It's scary because it makes you realize like you're not as in control as you think,
Yeah.
and these things have to be factored in
Yep.
to a degree. I think if you sort of over obsess over them, then it's probably just going to shut you down
Yep.
because there's no way to perfectly understand how they're all working at any one time.
Right.
But
Well, stay tuned,
yeah.
Jotham, because at the end of this episode, I'll be
Yes.
sharing some healthy ways that we can generate and regulate our hormones within our own body.
There we go.
Yeah.
Especially because, I mean, this whole article is about how, you talk about the Fab Five, which, by the way, is a great Michigan college basketball reference
There you go.
from the way back. So props for that, Johnny.
Yep.
But, you talk about like the five main players, right, in terms of hormones that people should know about. It seems like dopamine has been thrust into like way too much of a superior role with regard to everyday life for people, and not in a way that's good, right? In a way that's really hurting people. And I think that's what this article is all about, because she kind of talks about how, basically that it's just we're being bombarded by things that are going to elicit the release of dopamine so much more than in the past, that it's putting us in a very almost, I would say, vulnerable and a sort of addictive like cycle where we're kind of all addicts to dopamine. And so what happens when you're an addict and you're dealing with that kind of addictive cycle, there's withdrawal symptoms constantly, and there's you develop a tolerance for things. And so we know that dopamine is a molecule of more. And so if you're getting dopamine and you're developing tolerance, and you need more and more and more, and you have the withdrawal part of the cycle on the come down every single time, you can see what kind of a life this is providing to most people, right? It's a very frustrating and anxiety-provoking existence, because you have to keep feeding that dopamine monster,
Yep.
or else you're going to be living the withdrawal thing, but then you can never really get back to a base level. And I think one of the takeaways, you'll probably talk about this a little bit later on in terms of how it relates to your overall strategies for people when it comes to hormones, but one of the takeaways from this article is that she actually prescribes people to take a break from dopamine, like a 30-day almost cleanse, I guess you would say, to reset your baseline. Because again, when you're addicted to something, whether it's coffee or anything else, you keep needing more to get the same result. And eventually, you see this with, especially with like weed and alcohol. People start by doing it because of the high they get, right, or the buzz they get, or whatever. But eventually, you get such a tolerance, you establish such a tolerance that you are just doing it to like function normally on a day-to-day basis, not get any kind of pleasure out of it.
Yep.
When you cross that line, it's very, very dangerous, whether that's with alcohol or with social media or anything else.
Yep.
And I think the only way to sort of get back to a baseline level is to reset yourself, and that's to go without it for a certain amount of time. Which, I mean, just reading this article, it made me realize, even for someone who's kind of aware of this stuff, I think I could probably benefit from a month off from dopamine sources and things like that, whether it's the internet, social media, Twitter, that kind of thing. It's very, I think few people when it comes to addiction actually see that they've crossed the line until it's kind of too late. Most of the time that's the case. So let's get into some of our takeaways. What just from reading this article, what were some of the major takeaways you had, John?
Well, one of them was the concept, and one of the terms it was called was like dopamine fasting, which was a term coined by Dr. Seppa out in California, and did a lot of research. And sort of a few misconceptions about dopamine fasting: it does not lower dopamine levels, right? So I think that was one thing that people took away of like, oh, your dopamine levels will go down. No, that's not the case. It's sort of like a clickbaity term to get people to pay attention to it, but it's not to be taken literal, which was an important distinction. And the concept is sort of from a cognitive behavioral therapy approach of sort of identifying behaviors that are not in the best interest of the person and sort of desensitizing and sort of bringing them back from those types of behaviors. And the areas that they talk about were like emotional eating, excessive internet usage and gaming, gambling and shopping, porn and masturbation, recreational drugs, and like thrill seeking were the areas in which they look to sort of target to sort of reduce those things to give ourselves, like to your point, to give ourselves a break from it. And one of my biggest takeaways from the article was that if we, and you spoke about this too, like if we keep up this pattern for hours every day over weeks or months, the brain's set point for pleasure changes. Now we need to keep playing games, not to feel pleasure, but just to feel normal, like what you had mentioned.
Yep.
And how I think about that is it's no different than you're training your brain, like just like if you were doing push-ups or you were doing bench press or squat. After a certain point, your muscles adapt and you need to put on more weight. And it's no different than with this type of stuff. If you are starting to do weed or alcohol or cigarettes is another key example. With nicotine, you get that initial high, your brain adapts, and then it needs more of that. Your brain is a muscle, right? And so it responds very much in the same way. And the danger that I think that a lot of people are in is that withdrawal you speak of, and that it's just normal. I need too much dopamine in my head just to feel normal. And so then you'll actually, not only will you need that, but you will, if you're not conscious of it, you will unconsciously seek that out to give yourself that dopamine rush, because that's your new normal. And I think that once it goes into the subconscious, it's really dangerous to break that habit, because to your point, most people don't understand it's a problem until it's a real problem.
Yeah.
And so that was a big thing that came up to me too. And that relates not just with dopamine, but cortisol especially as well, that where any hormone that you have too much of in your brain, it becomes your default, your normal state, and then your brain will actually seek those things, those hormone like generators, because that's the normal state that it feels comfortable in, even if it's bad for it. And cortisol is a prime example of that with stress. When we overstress ourselves, our brain will actually seek it out because that's our default. We've created that to be our new normal.
So this is interesting, because this is where like sort of the term comfort or normal is a very relative kind of thing, and it's not always a good thing, right? I think what's comfortable or normal to a person's brain might actually really be hurting them, but it's what the brain's kind of grooved out a pathway for and is going to go seek it back. This makes me think of sort of not necessarily trauma, but like difficult relationships or being neglected in relationships. I think you see a lot of people repeat the same patterns with that kind of thing. And often that can be why, right? Is that this is their baseline, this is their normal. It's what they're most comfortable with because it's most familiar to them, but not comfort in a feel-good way. Comfort in a, I'm used to this, so I'm going to go back to that because it makes sense to me, even if it's horrible.
Right.
I think that's why you see people are doomed to repeat the same sort of mistakes in terms of who they choose for partners and things like that. This can be related to that.
Yeah, our brains hate discomfort, right? They're specifically designed to avoid it like at all costs, right? Even if it's not in our best interest. But the only way to expand and grow and mature is to come up to the threshold of discomfort and push through that so that you expand that a little bit further. But our brain doesn't think that way, right? And if we just leave it to do its own thing, it's going to settle into what's comfortable and what it knows and stay there unless we take very, very proactive steps to push ourselves through that.
Yeah, and I think it relates to what you just said. Made me think of like how what the brain deems as unfamiliar, it might actually be more biased to steer away from that and steer into something that's unhealthy, right? So it would choose unhealthy over unfamiliar a lot of times, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which is weird, but it just kind of happens sort of unconsciously. And it makes you realize that you have to be... This ties back into how in the last episode we talked a little bit about Marcellus Wiley and what he was saying and how you have to be responsible for your mental health. And this ties into that because not only as it relates to making sure you recognize how some of the things you've been through may have carved out a pathway that's at a disadvantage to you in terms of where your brain might groove back towards things that are unhealthy or toxic. But it also relates to just the concept of behavioral economics. Like we're going to get into like a Twitter thread towards the end of this episode that goes into life in the 50s versus life now. And this relates to this because I think life now, you have to, if you just coast by and you don't really increase your awareness about what's going on in your environment around you, it's going to negatively impact you because we live in a consumerist economy and culture where we're being bombarded by things at all times. Like it's like the concept of behavioral economics, right? Where companies and brands and platforms and things on the internet, there is a goal behind them, and the goal is to hijack your brain so that you spend money, right? And it reminds me of, I forget who said this quote, but the quote of like, if you're on the internet and you can't see what the product is, it means you're the product, right? And this Facebook is like an example of this, right? So when you're doing these things, like it's not like life was when it was less complicated, 50, 60 years ago. everything you do, when you drive, you're bombarded by fast food signs, right? When you're online, you're bombarded by ads, and you're bombarded by different things, and people trying to get certain hormones to release in your brain so that you make a purchase or that kind of thing. And you have to fight back. The only way to fight back is to do two things, in my opinion: get educated and do what you call it prehab, right? Where you're actually doing some proactive work to understand how to almost train your brain to be its best.
Defend against.
Yep. Reset the baseline.
Yep.
Be able to have sort of defenses against some of the things that are in our environment that are going to attack us in different ways.
Yep.
We have to accept that and start from that place. If people don't think that's happening, they are deluding themselves. And so, hey, denial is a real thing. But if a person is living in denial, they are ignoring the obvious, and it's probably hurting them.
Yeah, ways. I mean, and the denial just feeds into the comfort, right?
Yeah.
If I don't have to address the fact that I'm not okay, then I'm tricking myself into feeling comfortable.
Yep.
One shameless plug here. A friend of mine wrote a book called The Comfort Crisis. Michael Easter. I highly recommend people kind of look out for that one. It talks specifically about like how our new culture has just designed around us being comfortable, and that being a massive detriment to our health. So definitely check that book out. It's
Is
really
that more about like the illusion of comfort or actual comfort?
Both.
Working? Okay, because this ties into like what she talks about is seeing more and more patients who suffer from depression and anxiety, including otherwise healthy young people from loving families, elite education, and relative wealth. This is her quote: "Their problem isn't trauma, social dislocation, or poverty. It's too much dopamine, a chemical produced in the brain that functions as a neurotransmitter associated with feelings of pleasure and reward." End quote. So now, look, I feel like she kind of ignores how nuanced trauma is, and even maybe like hereditary trauma and how that can be passed through. But
generational trauma, everything.
Right, exactly. That being said, it does make me think of what you had just talked about with that book and that concept that we're all kind of wondering what's causing mental health trends to get worse, right? And so historically speaking, in the U.S. anyway, life has never been easier. I mean, it's with a broad brush, but like if you think about it, it's really never been easier. And maybe that is that comfort sort of like a sort of collective or cultural version of parents. We talk a lot about how parents, most people have probably heard the trajectory of a typical family where like the parents had to struggle and had to fight for everything they got, right? And had to, work 2 jobs or that kind of thing because their family had no money. And then they're successful. And then they have kids and they say, I don't want my kid to have to deal with what I had to deal with, which is a very noble thing. And you're trying to protect your kids and you want them to have a good life. But sometimes that goes so far, and there's a very fine line, in my opinion. It goes too far, and you rob kids of the chance to actually experience adversity, which actually will benefit them long term.
Yep.
So is this kind of like a collective version, a cultural version of things getting to the point where we've almost, things are too good? And is that what the comfort crisis kind of?
Yeah, I mean, it talks about like getting out of your own self and being and challenging yourself, putting yourself into states of discomfort, because then you start to prove to yourself you're actually more capable than you want. And he talks a lot about how things are relatively easy. We want food, boom, click of a button. We want this, click of a button. It's all so easy for us, and it's generating this inability for us to step outside of that and be uncomfortable for the sake of growth. And I think that, yes, I think she paints a little bit of a broad brush and sort of dismisses some things that could be contributing to the mental health crisis, specifically with trauma. And I'm sure we'll do a very specific episode around trauma specifically. But I do think that the comfort of what's going on has definitely contributed to the states of depression and anxiety too. If you don't have opportunities to execute on something difficult and either fail at it or get through it, you don't get that that definitely hinders your ability to feel good about yourself and see that you're capable of being able to handle these types of things. If you're never given opportunities to struggle, then you don't know how to when it happens. I don't say if, I say when. There are going to be moments of your life where you're going to struggle. You're going to have shit that comes up. You're going to not get the promotion you want. You're going to not get the job you want. You're going to whatever it is. No one goes through life without dealing with adversity. And if you're not given opportunities of how you can go that, and everybody, who's still here has 100% success rate of getting through tough times. And you need those opportunities to prove to yourself that you can, so that when it happens again, you know that you've been there before and you have an understanding of the systems and processes of how to get through that. And if we remove those systems, you're left with people feeling like, I don't know what to do.
Yep. Yeah, and it's sort of like an inversion of an emotional immune system, basically. It's like you're building that up over time. And, I mean, we've even seen, I think if, let's say, an infant, a parent with an infant, is constantly sanitizing their hands and doing different things like that, protecting them from germs and things like that. I've read that there is a correlation between that and actually weakening their immune system to the point where they can't actually fight off colds and things like that. So this to me is like an emotional or psychological version of that where, yeah, it seems good on the surface to protect your kids and not have them have to have a hard life, quote unquote, or deal with adversity. But what is that doing for them long term? Because like life is going to throw things at everybody, right? So if they're not capable of handling it when it happens, I don't think we've done right by them in terms of setting them up for that kind of, ability to live as a successful adult or a safe adult.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Adversity is a core component of growth.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's see. In terms of any other takeaways do you have from this article?
No, I think the big ones were really were about that. I liked the idea of this becoming like a part of prescription for treatment too, and I think it helped. She talked specifically about the person that she worked with, that it helped him understand the dopamine that was coming in and helped him to put in systems to not necessarily eliminate it altogether, because we can't, but to manage it a little bit differently. So he found out like what were the biggest dopamine hits that he was getting and how to manage those things so he was actually in control of them. So she talked a lot about like video game usage. So he gained an awareness of like the types of games that he's going to get sucked into and has a hard time pulling out from. So, sometimes those are referred to like the grind games, right? Or like you got 100% those games. I'm always like, those are the keywords I'm looking out for when I'm talking to kids about video games. Like, tell me, understand, like, what kind of game it is. So I thought that was a really cool takeaway, that by examining dopamine, it opened up the conversation to talk about like the things that are promoting that, which in our line of work can be a little bit more of a difficult conversation to have about like the introduction, to talk about specifically around porn and the addictive qualities of that, or gambling, or those places that produce lots of dopamine. It felt like it was a good way to talk about dopamine as the umbrella, and then talk about the specific places that they're getting that from, and then develop systems to manage those things. And that's really what everything's all about, is learning how to manage the hormones. And we'll talk about some systems and some ways to do that at the end as well. But that was another thing that I thought was a really cool, like, global takeaway, not necessarily specific, but that the way in which she approached it, I thought was really cool, of talking about like that, just the topic of dopamine helped understand and put systems into place to help support the individual. I thought that was kind of a cool way to do that.
No, it's interesting. And that ties into one quote that's sort of my last takeaway from this article. And it's, quote, "Our brains evolved this fine-tuned balance over millions of years in which pleasures were scarce and dangers were ever present. The problem today is that we no longer live in that world. Instead, we now live in a world of overwhelming abundance," end quote. So that it ties into how you have to be aware of how things historically have changed, and how, like you said, you have to be more self-aware with regard to your environment and make subtle changes so that you can adapt to the overabundance of some of these sources of pleasure and things like that. Because what formed our brains in over long periods of evolution, hundreds of thousands of years, was the scarcity of sources of pleasure, and really the imbalance of all these other sources of threat and other things. And it's sort of like reversed itself, and our brain hasn't adapted to that, because you can't adapt that quickly.
Right. Exactly.
So we did want to touch on, before we get into like the suggestions for people, I want to touch on a thread by Zane Khan. He's at Hey Khan, HEYKAHN on Twitter. And he talks about life now versus in the 50s. And he starts by saying that he talked to his father about his childhood today. And here's what his dad basically told him about what life was like in the 50s. And there's kind of 10 different takeaways. This is like a Twitter thread, right, where you have like 10 different sub tweets on the main tweet. And there were some interesting things. Now, is this like high level? Is this an example of like back in my day? Like sort of, yes. But like there's a lot of truth, right? Yeah. Walking, 2 miles into the snow, both directions uphill, right, kind of thing, to school. Yeah, sure. But there is some truth to it, and I think it relates to this dopamine article, because it shows you just in the span of 60 years, we're talking about the whole scope of human evolution. We're talking millions of years. In 60 years, just how much things have changed and how the brain can't adapt that quickly. And so it's on us to sort of be self-aware individually and as a culture to adapt, because otherwise the brain's not going to catch up that quick. So the 10 things they go through, and stop me if you want to like comment on any of them. The first one is that the post office was at the heart of every community. I think that speaks to how when you got exciting information or updates from people, it was very rare, right? You might get one letter a day, kind of, or one letter a week, or that kind of thing, right? I remember this. You remember the movie The Patriot?
Yeah.
Okay. You know how when Mel Gibson's on his like,
I know where you're going.
Yeah, his farm or whatever, and the mailman comes, right, the postman or whatever they called it back then, on horse and that kind of thing, and the kids are just like so excited. Like you're talking like an 18-year-old, like a 14-year-old, and they run. They have hand tied kind of like letter package kind of thing of like 5 letters, and it probably comes once a month, and they have to wait for their father to give them permission to open it, and then they get to open it, and it's like a little bit of news or that kind of thing, and it just shows you like that happened once a month and was very exciting, and that's probably a rush back then was a rush of dopamine for them in that moment. It was once a month. The rest of the time they were sort of dealing with just how to live, how to feed yourself, sustain food, that kind of thing, right? Yep. Nowadays, it's like that moment of them opening those letters happens to each person, 70 times a day?
Right.
Like just by opening Twitter and sort of like, refreshing your feed kind of thing like that. So to me, that's an example of like the overabundance of dopamine sources. So the second one is brands weren't everywhere. So to me, this is about sort of how we're bombarded by ads. And we talked about the whole behavioral economics system. There's also the pressure to signal worth every day through like material items. I don't think he gets into that a little bit. So brands weren't everywhere back in the 50s. 3, electronics weren't everywhere either, right? So it's not like you were, everyone had a phone or computer. Like that stuff didn't exist back then.
Right.
And these are all sources of dopamine.
Yep.
4th one is there was no social mobility. So going to college was still the exception. This also reflects how like work back then was still much more based on manual labor, which I actually think relates. Part of me thinks that the fact that physical mobility has been removed from typical everyday life of people is at our detriment. I don't think that's helping us, right?
Yeah, I mean, sitting down, lots of research will point to actually sitting down for like extended period of time is worse for your health than like smoking.
Yep.
So
yeah, exactly.
And we definitely have way more of a sedentary lifestyle than we did definitely in the 1950s for sure.
Yeah. Exactly.
Transportation wise, everything wise, it was you had to walk a lot more, or you had to be doing manual labor for most jobs or things like that. Absolutely.
Which has only gotten worse in the last 2 years because with the pandemic, remote work obviously increased,
gone up, and it's probably going to stick around for most companies too.
Exactly. And so I think people fail to recognize often that just from going to the office, you have to park, you have to walk into the office, you have to walk from office to talk to colleagues. You got to do like, if you wear a Fitbit or something else, like you'll see you're walking a 1.5 to 5 miles a day just around your building typically. And so when you're at home, you're not doing that.
No.
Like you're barely walking a quarter mile because you're just kitchen to couch, couch to kitchen, bathroom, couch. Like you're not going to rack up the mileage there. You know what I mean? So. So that was that one. The next one is there's more physical danger back then. Dying of a cold wasn't unthinkable. The 6th one is there was less psychological suffering. So there's more physical danger, but less psychological suffering. He refers to like drug abuse, alcoholism, anxiety, and loneliness weren't worries for most people. Most people spent their entire lives in the safety of parents, homes, and communities. This one in particular, I think, is more of like biased towards maybe his dad's perspective from the community he grew up in.
Yep.
Drug abuse, alcoholism, anxiety, and loneliness. Maybe not loneliness back then as much because it was more collective, even in the U.S. compared to how it's so individualistic now.
Yep.
But drug abuse, alcoholism, and anxiety, I think, has always been
I agree.
there.
I think it's just one of the things that wasn't talked about.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. And
or normalized, especially alcoholism.
Exactly. And most people spent their entire lives in the safety of parents and homes and communities. I wouldn't say communities were, safer back then, or that more people had great lives, or that kind of thing. That was probably his experience.
Yep.
7 is material lives were poorer, but products lasted longer. So again, like, you didn't have to feel the need to upgrade every 5 seconds to things like we're kind of bombarded with now. Things actually lasted long. Let's see. The next one, 8th one, is inner lives were richer. So families were bigger, neighbors were closer with each other. I would say that, the what's now referred to as IRL, right, in real life, I think that kind of lifestyle was more present in terms of just interacting in person with people and being more friendly. I would say now a lot of stuff is online, and with the how communities are more spread out now and suburban and car driven and things like that. I think it is a little bit different in terms of how you interact with people.
Yeah, and I'd say that this wasn't necessarily just to like the 1950s. I'd say that this has been a change probably in the last like 10 to 15, maybe 20 years. Because I mean, my experience was very neighborhood. We had like everybody looked out for everybody. So if like my parents couldn't pick us up from school, my neighbors would, or vice versa. Everyone's feeding everybody. It was much more of like Eaton Road, right? It was like a collective of individuals and families, and it was much more communal. Like, come home, you're not coming in the house until dinner time, and we're playing out in the street and things like that. Like, and I remember when I was working in schools, I was like prescribing like with families like block parties or like get out and meet your neighbors and things like that, because it was like you said, I think in the last, and definitely the pandemic heightened this, but like everybody's getting a lot of their social interaction online, right? And it's a very different thing than it was when you're working, like when you were with somebody or a collective piece, like going to knock on someone's door to see if they're home. Now it's like sending them a message or whatever it is. It's very different.
I agree. And I grew up in a very similar, situation. I grew up in Chelmsford, Massachusetts, and it was, we would just like ride bikes everywhere and walk around. Like I wouldn't come back until it was dark and no one would be worrying about me, right? And I think the digital revolution has taken this to a whole nother level. But even before that, I think what happened probably in the 90s, started in the 80s, but got worse in the 90s and into like the early 2000s was this sort of gradually increasing obsession with the possibility of abduction. I think that did in the United States. Maybe it's because, serial killer things were popularized or whatever started to happen. Parents started to get more and more protective, and you started to see less and less of a leash with just letting your kids go out and do things. And I actually think that's really played a huge role in worsening mental health situations for kids, because they often aren't given the chance to have unsupervised play. We've talked about this, I think, in past episodes, where it's like the importance of having a young kid be around siblings and around friends without parents lurking to step in and solve problems every time they happen is really at their detriment. It relates to the whole emotional immune system we talked about earlier. So that's gotten worse with tech, but the first wave was just parents being much more afraid of their kids being abducted or things like that, and not allowing the freedom to go roam around town anymore.
I agree. And one other piece too, and it's semi-related, but I think one of the other feedback that I got from parents too, and I would say especially in more like affluent towns where like college is the thing that they're teaching their kids about from like when they're 5 years old, is that parents would be like, there's no kids in the neighborhood anymore because they've got Russian math and they've got violin and they've got band and they've got extra reading and they've got tutors, and there's just like the availability to have unstructured time is, to your point, like gone, because it's filled with structured time to help them.
Obsessively structured time.
Agreed. And not realizing, and I think there's social pressures too of, if your kid isn't in the right thing, you're feeling guilt and pressure as a parent because am I not setting my kid up for success? It's like this whole cyclical piece.
Right?
Agreed. Exactly. Yep.
Your kid becomes almost another version of clothing, right?
Agreed.
It's like status symbol.
100%.
Which is scary and kind of sad.
Yep.
So that was number 8. The 9th one is there was more social cohesion back in the 50s. So and it was just interesting because they put like there was no Instagram or MTV to see how the rich and famous lived. No one knew or cared how the other half lived. I believe that, and I think I would guess life was a lot more simple when you didn't have to constantly get bombarded by what other people are doing that may look better than what you're doing. And I think that the desire to compare ourselves to others is going off the charts these days. I mean, you see it in young kids. They just never feel good enough because they're looking at Instagram and other things, and it's like there's always someone with more, someone cooler, someone this. To be bombarded by that at all times is really what's unfair for a developing brain, because they don't know how to reconcile that.
No, and even before social media, it was reality TV and the explosion of reality TV.
Yeah, that's what we kind of grew up around.
Right,
it was
exactly.
MTV and then the reality TV shows.
Exactly.
And shit like that.
Right, exactly.
Excuse me, stuff like that. Yeah. So the last one is, in some ways, life was easier. Marriages didn't have to be a love story. Work didn't have to be where you found meaning. People didn't expect to be happy all the time. There's a lot of value in those 3 things, right? I think, especially the last one, people didn't expect to be happy all the time. I think, I don't know when this started, but maybe in the last 10, 15, 20 years, maybe a little bit more than that, people more and more sort of seem to be under the illusion that life is like, you're supposed to be gearing your life to be happy all the time. And that's not possible. It's not.
No,
it'd
be exhausting.
Exactly. And we talk a lot about expectations. When you set your expectation, the bar that high of like, well, I should be happy all the time. That's what, there's people out there that are happy all the time, and I'm not, so that means my life sucks, or I need to change, or woe is me kind of thing. That the formula we say is like happiness equals reality minus expectations, right? And so if your reality is here and your expectations are here, you're at a huge deficit. Whereas if your reality is here and you have 0 expectations, you have a surplus and you're okay, right? And I think that it factors into this, that we're not supposed to be happy all the time. Like happiness or joy, I guess you'd say, as an emotion, is fleeting. It comes in moments, but that's not necessarily a baseline. It's not supposed to be. I think that that also relates to maybe the comfort crisis that you talked about that book. But how things are so good for us that we just expect, like, the lack of adversity makes us have these unrealistic expectations about being happy all the time or having the perfect marriage all the time or whatever.
Right. I think that the joy piece relates back to like the dopamine, right? We can't have dopamine present, and we can't, just like we can't have joy present all the time,
Exactly.
right? It's this balance of being able to manage joy or introductions of joy, but it can't be all the time. And like you said, if the expectation is I'm supposed to just feel this elation and happiness all the time, and I have had conversations with people, a lot of conversations with people who are like, I'm just not happy. I'm not happy all the time. And it's like, okay, let's talk about what that would look like you being happy all the time. Is that a realistic expectation for us to try to hold, or is there something different that we need to be talking about? And it always ends up being like, well, let's manage the good times when we can, let's manage the hard times when they come as well. But the point, like, at the relation between like joy and dopamine are like the exact same, right? Because a lot of times joy promotes dopamine, right? And so if we're always joyful, it's the same thing. We're just always feeding ourselves dopamine, and that's not a healthy way to live.
Totally. And it relates back to, there was this quote in the dopamine article. It said, pleasure and pain are processed in the same parts of the brain. The brain tries to keep it in balance in this thing called homeostasis. Like, so literally, the more pleasure you experience, the more your brain is going to try to pull you back. And there's going to be a sort of boomerang effect to that. And I think that shows you that we're not meant to be in some perfect, joyful place all the time.
No.
And an extreme example of this, and this is why I always refer to substance use as borrowed happiness from the next day. Because what you're essentially doing is you're using drugs or chemicals to chemically induce a different level of dopamine release or hormone release that your body's not naturally going to do.
Right.
And so if your max capacity on a given day is a 10 and you're drinking on that given day, you're probably going to get to a 13. But guess what? Tomorrow, your ceiling is 7.
Yeah.
That's what happens.
Yep.
Right. And so you have to recognize that your body's always trying to stay in balance. And that's why, like, I think the more people become self-aware and emotionally aware, the more they stop looking at sadness like it's a bad thing, and they start to look at like a flip side of a coin with joy.
Yep.
And that it's just part of life, and it's part of that spectrum. And you maybe you dip a little too far into sadness sometimes, and then you have to do things to kind of like balance it out. And this, sort of brings us to our last part of this episode, where we're gonna, you're gonna give some suggestions about how do people. All right, we know that. We've talked about how the risks and the importance of self-awareness when it comes to understanding hormones, understanding our environment, the digital environment, how it's hijacking these things. What would you say to people in terms of, like, what are some healthy ways for them to maybe prescribe some angles into healthy hormone release or hormone balance achieving?
Yeah, so this probably won't be too much of a shocker for most people, because I'm going to list out the things that you've been probably hearing for a lot of time, like exercise, good sleep hygiene, healthy eating, meditation, and breath training are some of the most effective ways to organically release some of those different pieces. And the one interesting differential specifically to exercise, which can generates dopamine, also really heavily releases endorphins, that when you go because you feel like you need to versus you want to, there's a difference in the neurochemicals that get sort of released and the neurotransmitters that get released into your brain. And so if you're going there because you're like, I look a certain way, or I'm fat, or I don't look great, and I need to do this because of that, it's different than if you're going there with the recognition of this is going to be hard, but I'm going to feel great afterwards. That's different, and your brain codes that different, and you want to try to get to the place of I'm doing this because I know it's going to be. Intention is huge. And so when I talk about exercise, I want to make that differentiation between that, because, and this is another art, we can talk about this in another podcast too, but weight and body dysmorphia is huge, and huge among men. It's not talked about as much, but it's a huge thing, and that's a big distinguishing factor of like going there because I know I'm going to purposely putting yourself into a state of discomfort with the understanding that it will be beneficial for you because you'll feel better, not look better, is a big differential. So exercise is a really great way to sort of promote good, healthy endorphins. Also, breath training, breathing on purpose, is a really effective way to do that. And through different types of breathing exercises and stuff like that, you can actually physically release endorphins into the brain. And this is the type of stuff when I talk to clients about breath training, and I gauge their reaction to when I'm talking about the importance of it. And we've talked about this before, like tons of eye rolls or gruffs, or you're telling me I'm going to feel better from breathing.
It can't be that easy.
It can't be that easy, right? And so you start talking about like what neurologically changes and shifts in your brain when you do this type of stuff. That starts to help release those things. And breath training, like I said, endorphins are sort of like the morphine for the brain. So it sort of blocks the receptors that receive like pain. So it helps with that. It also sort of activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is sort of like the tranquilizer for your nervous system.
Like the brake pedal.
Yeah,
Yep.
exactly. Kind of helps you like settle down and manage the hormones that might be contributing to anxiety, like cortisol and adrenaline and those types of things. So the other stuff for dopamine, music is a really effective way to do those things. There was an interesting article and research on the difference between instrumentals and lyrics, which I thought was pretty interesting. And they said that instrumentals was a more effective way to receive dopamine than was with the presence of lyrics.
That's how I get into a flow state. I listen to instrumental-based music, a lot of like music scores from like movies and soundtracks and things like that without words.
Yep.
Like made by composers. Locks me in and totally calms me down. So that might be subjective, but I definitely notice.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. And I think one of the discerning factors of like when we're talking about hormone release and management is that these are done with a purpose, right? I think with dopamine especially, we get dopamine hits from our phone that we're not planning on, right? Yep. Or that we don't have any control over, so our brain doesn't really know what it's just getting flooded.
Yeah.
Us purposely adding dopamine to ourselves when we may need it, or purposely adding serotonin or endorphins or things like that is very, very different from like a neurological standpoint, very different of how we're approaching managing our hormones than just like by accident.
Yeah.
When we're in control, we're teaching our brain that we are in control of these hormones, and then when we can start to recognize when we're not in homeostasis or we're not in a place that we are because we have been actively training ourselves to manage these hormones in a different way. And that's a different way of thinking about it that I try to instill when I'm working with different clients. So and serotonin is the other one too. And again, a lot of the same things I'm talking about is really important. Getting yourself into like healthy sleep management and healthy sleep cycles really helps to release serotonin, and really helps to sort of manage all of those different things. So, and serotonin, like I talked earlier before, is sort of one of the main hormones. The misrepresentation or the lack thereof of the receptors in the brain can lead to anxiety and depression and things like that. And so exercise is a good one. Breath training, meditation especially, is one of the really great ways to try to release the serotonin and sort of activate new neurotransmitters and neural pathways to help facilitate those types of things. So I could speak about this for another 4 hours, so I won't, but those are some really healthy ways to do that. And I know that we've talked about habit forming in the past, and so a lot of the things that I mentioned, exercise, healthy eating, good sleep, meditation, and breath training, help to manage all of these. I sort of specifically talked about ones that help to generate multiple. There's a lot more different activities that you can do, like oxytocin, like either through physical touch or embrace, or even sensory things like wearing a compression shirt or things like that.
Yeah, you can do it to yourself too. Right. I think this
exactly.
doesn't have to be. You can kind of hijack the brain's need for that.
Agreed.
By providing touch for yourself. I know that sounds weird, but like you can do that.
Yep.
In a very intentional way. You don't need a partner to do that. You
nope.
know. I think this is where like even like weighted blankets are something that people use as a way to kind of provide this kind of thing sometimes. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is kind of the cool, fun stuff of like affecting and changing your brain on purpose and recreating new neural pathways in your brain to sort of restructure the way that you manage yourself. And when you start to really dive in and do the work, not only are you more in control, but you're more observant when things are not. And you can start to do, then you have a set of systems and things like that to work back to. And like I was saying before about habits, is that if you start treating this stuff like just general hygiene or prehab work of like the importance of exercise, the importance of eating well, the importance of breath training and meditation, and like incorporating those into your everyday, if those are just things you're doing, you will be working on the management of your own emotions, just because these are the things that you just take care of every day. And
you have to. I mean, we keep talking about this, but we're going to keep shouting it till we're blue in the face. It's no longer a luxury. You have to be doing this, if for nothing else, because culturally, collectively, in terms of our experience, things have changed so much so quickly, and our brains have not adapted that if you're not doing this, you're at a deficit. You're just going to be at a deficit. It's going to affect you emotionally and psychologically, and you're often not going to really see it until it's too late, and it's going to do different things. You have to be taking control of these things through self-awareness and through prehab methods to protect yourself against some of the things, whether it's just everyday life or the behavioral economics and the things we're being
Yeah.
bombarded with through technology and what we see when we go into our environment every day. So
yeah, and it's not a representation of weakness to add these things. I think that's a big
the opposite,
barrier.
yeah,
It's literally the exact opposite.
Yeah.
You are strengthening yourself by doing these things and leaving yourself less vulnerable and susceptible to mental anguish or whatever it happens to be by doing these things. It's harder to do. It contributes to strength. I think a lot of the conversations and barriers that I get with young guys and just people in general is that like, oh, if I need to be doing this, I can't do it on my own. Well,
Classic
no, I'm
young
teaching
guy
you
thing
how
to
to
say.
do it
Yeah,
on
yeah,
your
yeah.
own, right?
Yeah,
Like I'm teaching
yeah.
you how to do this on your own. You don't have the skills, so I'm giving you the skills so you don't have to be feeling like you can't do this or managing these things. And then these are the skills that you can be able to do these things yourself. So it's, man, agreed. I'm going to be blue in the face screaming this as loud as I can, but this is the stuff. And Sarah Lazar, who's a researcher out of Harvard, talks about like that saying, like, this is no longer a nice to have, it's a need to have.
Yeah.
And we've passed that point. These are things you need to be doing every day.
Absolutely. So we appreciate everyone listening to this episode on hormones and specifically dopamine. We'll put a link to that dopamine article in the show notes. And again, I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode, and we'll be back next week.